Okay, so welcome to this module 6, Introduction to Web Programming. And what we're going to have a look at in this module is HTML5 forms and form validation. Yes, so we have had looked at forms yesterday. Today we're going to talk about the new features that HTML5 provides you from forms perspective. And also we're going to talk about form validation, right? Now, when we talk about using forms for validation, fine, it's important to understand validation, and it's also important to understand why do we require validation, right? So this course is brought to you by OdinSchool, which is an upscaling technology platform where we help you continuously to acquire new skills. So you stay skilled and stay ahead. I'm Sumit Vijay Vajpayee. I'm a Maxwell certified trainer, and I'm delivering trainings on mean, moon, and full stack technology from past 14 years. My other skill set include Angular, React, Vue, GraphQL, Mongo, Node, AI, and machine learning. Right? So, why learn form validation? Now we need to understand what is form validation. At a very simple level, we can understand form validation is validating the input data that the user is sending in. Right? So you would want your user to have the information that he's typing in to be filled in correctly. Now, validations can be of different types. So let's say if I talk about what can be validated. So as we discussed yesterday, forms are a way of fetching out the details from the user. So when I talk about the form, fine, I can have different validations in a picture. Let's say if I talk about validation, I can be talking about different kinds of validation, meaning I can check first for the presence of data, right? Now, if something is important, let's say for example, you are trying to have a sign up form, right? And in the sign up form, if you are wanting the user to enter the username and password both, he cannot bypass that. For such thing, you just need to check the presence of data. So that's the first step about validation, to check for the presence of data. Now the second step of validation can be to check whether the data is present in a particular format. So I'm going to check the format of data, right? So if I'm expecting the user to enter a particular format, fine, and if it's adhering to that, then I would say that my text is valid within the input type, right? So I can check for the format of data. Now this can be any format. Let's say for example email address, then you have dates, fine, you can have a number of things which can talk about format. Then you can check for the correctness of the data, right? Now here so we'll discuss on the different types of validation, fine, but this is, let's say, the correctness of data that you are also checking for, whether what is entered is correct or not, right? Now there can be n number of other things as well. So from formatting perspective, you can check whether the user has typed in a number or not, or whether he has entered characters, what kind of data has he entered. Those all things can be checked into validation. So validation is just checking if the user that is entering the data is it in a correct format or not. Now this validation that we try to do in can be of different types. So let's understand what are the different types of the validation. Now before that, we're going to, as I said, we're going to work with HTML forms. Okay, we're going to understand the form validation, and we're also going to work with built-in form validation attributes with HTML5. So let's understand what this form validation is. So before submitting data to the server, it is important to ensure all required form controls are filled out, right? So when we talk about the form validation, we understand that yes, this data that I'm expecting the user to fill in should have the details entered in a correct manner. And what correctness I can check for? I can check for whether the data is present or not, the presence of the data. I can check for the format of the data. I can check for the value of the data, okay, whether it is a string, number, and things like that. So that's the correctness of the data that I'm talking about. Now this is called client-side form validation. Now we have two types of validation. One is client-side, second is server-side. Now when we say we have having client-side validation, earlier when we used to work with JavaScript as a part, we specifically focused on this client-side form validation. right? But if JavaScript suppose is not used, I can still use my server-side validation. But client-side validation, when we say it's an important feature, right? Because it's an initial check and an important feature, as I said, of a good user experience. So if I'm validating things on the client side, I'm doing it in a better manner. Why? Because catching invalid data on the server side can just take a noticeable delay, fine, causing a round trip to the server and then back to the client, and then tell the user to fix their data. So user enters some information, he clicks on a button, he sends the data back to the server. On the server side, you check, let's say, okay, this is not the correct information, and then you send back the response back to the client, only for the user to appear that there is an error, that's what has occurred because he has not entered the correct format, or he has not entered the data in a correct way that we are expecting him to be. So instead of we going back to the server and bringing back the data and having that round trip to be saved, we do the client side form validation. So what advantage do we have? The user can just fix it straight away. It means when he enters the fields, the data in the fields, and by some means he has missed out on filling on some fields, and he clicks on the button that is submitting back to the server. Before I submit the things back to the server, I would want my user to know that these are the details that he has not entered in the correct format. So this is, so to discuss on the basic things of form validation, we discussed yesterday on forms. So forms are nothing but a way of taking input from the user, and when you talk about validation, it's a process of validating the form, and either you can do it on the client side or you can do it on the server side. But client side is something which is important because it provides you a quick fix way of the end user to correct his data, right, rather than investing a time to go back to the server and do it. But server side validation is also important because you cannot neglect the fact that everything can be done on the client side. For example, let's say if you are checking for a format of an email, right? So let's say here you are going back and having an user to enter his email. Now when the user enters an email into the text box, right, he would, let's say for example, you go back and say XYZ. Now every email that you see must have @ sign, and so some text @ something dot something. So you can see @ and dot is something which is mandatory, and that's the reason why you would expect that the format of the email should be in this form, right? So let's say suppose he enters XYZ @xyz.com. Now you see here, if you're from the client side, as I said, what you can check for the presence of data. Yes, the data is present. Fine. So now it is valid from the data presence perspective. Is the data in a correct format? Yes, the data is also in the correct format because there is some text. Fine. There is some text which is, so these two texts are separated by @ sign, and these two texts are preceded by the dot sign, and that's the reason why the format is right. And so the presence of data is there and the format is also right. But what about the correctness of data? Whether the user has entered a correct email address or not. Now for this, client side cannot help you, because on the client side, what you cannot know, or what you cannot just query and see whether this is a correct email or not. Now, how do you check if the correct email or not? You can go back to the server. On the server side, you have some code, and that code basically shoots an confirmation email to your inbox. If you are a correct user, you will be sent a link and you'll be shown a message saying that, okay, you have registered successfully. Now please go back and click on the confirmation link from your email address, so that we come to know that you are an authenticated user and the email address is kind of valid, right? So for such thing, we obviously need to have our server side into picture, right? So we cannot do everything on the client, but yes, on the client we can do most of the stuff which is from the presence of the data and for the formatting of the data. And this correctness, we can have the correctness also to be matched on the client as well as on the server side. Let's say I gave an example of email where we understand that server is the one who's going to have some coding for shooting the mail to the inbox and then the user clicking onto that, so that if it's redirected, then you are going in a correct manner. So for such purposes, we require validation. So for the server side to write this coding, we are wanting to have the server to enter some information and send some things as an inbox, as a mail to the inbox. Now for that, we require some server side coding, and that's how normally the email address is ideally being validated. It's a two-step process. First is the format, and second is shooting the mail to the inbox. Now this helps ensure data submitted matches the requirements set forth in the various form controls. Right? So the form controls that are expecting data to be in a format, they are that, and that's what we are expecting with the form validation. Right? Now, how do you perform form validation? Now with HTML5, if you do get some attributes which are by default, right? So before moving on to the attributes, let's understand what all things are HTML5 from a validation perspective. Now, yesterday we talked about, so I'll come back to my Visual Studio Code. Right? I'll come back to my Visual Studio Code, and here if I try creating a new folder, creating it in here, yes. So this is module 6, and in module 6, I'm going to create a new file, and I'm going to say, let's say, no validation dot HTML. Now here, if I go back and specify some HTML which is not performing any validation. So let's say I'm going to have a form. Now, as we discussed on, without writing an action, without writing anything, this is still a valid HTML5 form, right? That's how you use an HTML5 form, as we discussed yesterday. But if I'm trying to have, let's say, some value to be entered, let's say I want username to be entering and input. Now you have two choices. One is input type equal to text. Now you can do that just by typing in input. Now is again an HTML5 feature. If I just say input, this is by default going to create a text box for me. So I don't have to each time go back and say type is equal to text, because with HTML5 now, even if you don't write type equal to text, that will still be considered to be a text box, right? And then if I come back and want to have, let's say, a password being entered by the user, fine, and I would want this to be input type equal to password. So I'll say input, and but I'll say this to be of type password, and then I want to have my input type equal to submit. Now here I'll be using input type equal to submit, and then I'll be using a value which says submit. Right? Now if I right click and say open with live server, so this allows me to enter the information. So this is username, fine, this is password, fine. If I click on submit, fine, this is absolutely no problem. So you can see the page being kind of refreshed because I'm not validating anything. But what I'm going to do is, I do not want user not entering username or not entering password. So let's say talk about username. Now here, if I go back and have an H1 which basically says sign in. Okay. Now I want to click on the button and want to check if the text is having some text box is having some text or not, right? Now here there is no validation being done. Now we have different ways of validation. Now how you can do the validation? Let's have a look at it. So there are different types or different ways in which validation can be performed. One is by using JavaScript. So JavaScript, as we discussed with the evolution of the web, we said JavaScript is a language which allows you to validate your data, right? It is any programming language which is allowing you to sit on the client, execute on the browser. It's a scripting language, and then it provides you the dynamicism to have some programming logic being written for your application for validation purposes. So not only for validation, for other purposes as well, but JavaScript 90% of the time was used on the client side for validation purposes earlier, right? Now gone are those days because JavaScript virtually is used everywhere. Fine, so you can use JavaScript on the client, on the server, at a database level. Fine, a JSON format, which is a variation of JavaScript to share information across the wires and all. So JavaScript is present everywhere. Then you have third-party library, which are JavaScript libraries, okay, which can be used for validations. So they give you methods, fine, which can allow you to perform those things out of the box, right? And if you don't want to use it now because you're learning HTML5, you can still go back and make use of the built-in HTML5 features, right? Now, if you want to validate, as I said before HTML5, if you want to validate, JavaScript was the only way. Now I'm going to give you a quick overview of how the things were performed, right? And then we're going to move on to a built-in HTML5 features after it, right? Now here, if you see around, this is no validation. Now if I want to have the validation with my HTML using JavaScript, so I'll say use JS for validation, and here I'm going to use the same code, fine, and now I'm going to click on the button and I would just check if this text box is having the data. Now here I would identify my text box by using an ID. Now ID is a unique identifier. So if you remember when we worked with hypertext, okay, hyperlinks, in those hyperlinks we were referring to hash of something, which was basically referring to the ID, and ID, as we know, is a unique identifier. Now here this is going to be, let's say, txt username. Now this txt username is an identifier of this particular item. Now when I click on this button, fine, now if you want you can just click on the in input type equal to submit. I'll just click, say, instead of doing that I can go back and just use on a form an event, okay, you can use on click onto this as well, right? But I'll just say on submit of it to be handled here. Now either you can use the submit button or you can use the button tag. So let's do with the button tag so that it's much simpler, because I don't want to go into submission of the form and then see the things. So I'll just say input type equal to button, I'll say value is equal to submit, and on the click of the button, so click is an event. So events are something which notify your application that some user interaction has happened. So on click is the default event given to you by HTML, right? And you can work with this on click event for most of the controls which are being given to you. So on the click, what I want is I want a method to be called. Let's say I want to call a method called as validate, right? Now this is custom written method, and because it's a method, I need to go back and write it into a programming tag that we learned when we were learning HTML tags, and script is one of the programming tag. Now there's again an HTML5 new feature with this programming tag, which is script, that allows you to write JavaScript without typing type is equal to text / JavaScript. So this is still a valid HTML5 programming script tag. Now here what I'm going to do is, now how will I check whether this text box contains some data or not? Now I will check by accessing this ID. Now how do you do that? This is done by using what we call as DOM APIs, right? So document object model, which basically represents an hierarchy of your HTML in the form of objects. That's what the browser creates. So browser is capable of parsing your HTML and creating the objects corresponding to the HTML that it is parsed, and that's what we call as DOM. So document object model, document represented as objects in the model format, right? Now here, if I want to have an access to the text box as an object, I can just use a document object given to me for an access in the JavaScript as a language. I can say get element by ID, and here I would just go back and try to use the ID, which is txt username. Now this is what I will get an access to a text box as an object. So txt would represent an object that corresponds to this text box. Now how do I know the value of it? I will just check the value, that if txt dot value, fine, equals empty, fine, or txt dot value, right, is equal to null, right? Now you can just check any of these. So even if you check for the empty value, that's also fine, right? And now here, if that's the case, I want to show an alert message to the user saying that username is required, right? So I'll just come back and rectify this, and that's what will be displayed if I have not entered the username, right? So right click, open with live server, and now if I just click on the submit button, yeah, txt dot value equals maybe an empty value. That's what I'll be doing. So on the click of a button, I need to put it into validate as a function. Sorry for that. Yes, so this is the validate function, and within the validate function, I have to go back and check this. Okay, now the function that we have written to call will be invoked on a click of a button. So this is the validate function. That's what I'm calling in. Well, I'll be wrapping that into that function. So I'll right click, open with live server, and now when I click on the submit button, I get username is required. If I enter some value and I go back and say submit, fine, there will not be any problem and the form can be submitted if I'm using input type equal to submit successfully. Right now here we did the validation using JavaScript. So what we did, we had an access to the element. We went ahead and checked if the element's value, that's a property, DOM property, by which you understand whether the value is empty or not, and then you go back and alert a message to the user saying that he cannot actually go ahead until unless he enters the value to it. Right now, the reason why I did not go ahead with input type equal to submit was if the value is there, then I do not want to submit the page. So I and go back and say e dot prevent default and things like that, which I didn't want it to go in because that's core JavaScript. I kept it simple by just using input type equal to button. Right now, this is what developers used to do earlier when they were working with JavaScript and HTML. So this was the only way, fine, or using the same logic but using JavaScript libraries, where the way by which I would be able to understand, okay, whether the user has entered the correct values or not, right? But now with HTML5, I do get this validation out of the box using the built-in attributes that HTML5 gives you, right? So now if I'm trying to make use of my HTML5 attributes, which are built-in attributes, I can do that. So let's have a look at the same example, but we will not be using JavaScript for validation purposes, but we would be using HTML5 built-in attributes for doing that, right? So let's have a look at the default modules, or sorry, the attributes which are there in your HTML5 things to perform it. Now these are your HTML5 validation attributes. So you can see you have required, you have max length, min, no validate, max, pattern, min length. These are all the different attributes that you get for working with HTML5 validation out of the box. Right now, let's see how do we make use of each of these attributes. Right, so I'm going to go back to Visual Studio Code. I'm going to create a new file and I will say built in HTML5 validation, and here I'm going to have my same HTML to be used in, right? I'm going to have the form, right? I'm going to have username and password again to be entered in, and here with this username and password to be entered, I'll say the ID which is text username. Now because I'm not using any JavaScript, I may not be using this ID, and I also may not be using this on click because there is no JavaScript that's going to get executed. Now if I want the same exact thing what we did using JavaScript for validation, we can do it by using HTML5 by just adding a simple attribute, and that attribute is required. Now what I want you to understand here is there is some significance with this required keyword and the form that you are writing in. Fine, so let's understand this required in the very simplest way, and then we would see when will this be working or not. Now if you are trying to make use of this required as an attribute, which is what we call as a boolean valued attribute, right? So even if you don't say required is equal to true or something, that's just going to be ignored, and this required is the only thing which you require, right? So you can even go back and say required is equal to required. Fine, so that's also a value. So for HTML validators who do not accept only a boolean valued attribute, just required is equal to required can also serve the purpose, right? But only saying required is also sufficing. That's sufficient for you to make sure that your project or your application is going to behave in a way that it is to be behaved in. So for your browser to understand. Now if I do this, have a look. If I right click and click with Open Library Server, and if I just click on the button right now, you will see it does not give me any of the message. Now this is deliberately I've done so that you understand that even though you have said required, okay, you are still not able to get back the message. Now the reason why you are not able to get back this message is because of this button. Here what we have used input type equal to button. Now the moment you use this input type equal to button, it does not, as we discussed yesterday on different types of buttons, if you remember, we discussed on input type equal to button, input type equal to submit, input type equal to reset, right? Now with this input type equal to button, I will not be able to submit the page or submit the form. So it has to do nothing with the validation as well. Fine. So only if you use input type equal to submit, then your default validations would work. It would not work with input type equal to button. Fine. So that's a very first important point which I want you to make sure of that you understand. So let's go back and make the necessary changes. So I'll say input type equal to submit. Let's come back to the UI. Fine. And here, if I click on the submit button now you see, please fill out this field. Right. Also, what I want to tell you is, when you have this required to be there in the username, please make sure that you are having it wrapped in a form tag, because if I just use it just like this, now here if I'm clicking on the button, you don't have that being triggered off. The reason, because it has to be wrapped in a form tag. So input type equal to submit is going to submit the form, and before submitting it, it's just going to check for the items to be validated or not. Fine. So now if this is the case, and if I don't enter anything, then you will see please fill out this field, and that's how your Chrome browser display this. Now why am I saying this? Because every browser has its own way of showing how this text message and the things are being shown in, right? So if I copy this and put it with Firefox, let's come back, paste, hit enter. If I click on submit, you can see please fill out this field. Now this text box is being bordered red, and that's how Firefox is showing you. If I go back to, let's say, Edge, opening up, or even for I for that matter. So let's say if I'm waiting for I, I'll just paste, hit enter, and if I try to click on the submit button, now you see please fill out this field, which is exactly the same as what Chrome is. Fine. And if I just go back and use my Internet Explorer, pasting, hit enter, this is I11, and now if I click on the submit button, you see this is a required field and it's a different way that it's being represented. Yes, there are ways of customizing this as well, right? So if you don't want this icon to be there, a different icon, so there are different ways in which stylings and things can be done. Right now we are not going into it because we are seeing HTML5 form validations. Right, so here we understand that HTML5 by default gives you some attributes by which you can perform the same exact thing what you did with JavaScript. Now there are other attributes as well which allow you to specify whether the entered value is correct or not. This is from presence of the data, right? You're just checking whether the data is present or not. But what if you want to check the format of it? And what if you want to check whether this is in a range or not, right? Now here, if I'm trying to go back and specify something, I need to understand that for any of the length. So here, let's say this is required. Fine, I can go back and even specify min length. Fine, so I can restrict the user from the length of it. Let's say I say the minimum length as 4 as the user should enter, and have maximum length as, let's say, 10. Fine. Now if I do this, let me go back and enter some values. So here I'll just say S, and if I try to click on the submit button, you can see a different message. It says, please lengthen the text to be 4 characters or more. You're currently using 1 character. So if I go back and enter the correct value, then there is absolutely no problem. You can see the page being refreshed, right? But if suppose I go back and try to enter more values, so I'll say 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and after this, so 10 characters complete. I don't know if you're able to hear this hit. I'm hitting the key, but it's not allowing to enter any values because the max length is basically restricting it. Now, the same thing we used to do by using JavaScript. So again, we need to go back and on the click of a button, I need to have an access to the text box, read the text box value. Within that value, check the length of it. Okay, if then we're converting into an length item. Okay, understanding. Okay, this is something which is an integer value, and now if that length is greater than something or less than something, then I may be showing a message to the user. Right now, this is being taken off, and you can do it by using the min length and the max length for string representations to be done. Right? Okay. Now, same is the case with another type. So let's say with input with HTML5, you get a different type of input. So we're going to talk about new input types as we move ahead with the next session as well. But just for simplicity, I'm just having this input type to be introduced here, and other input types we're going to talk about in more in the next session as we're going to go up. And right now, I'll just use my input type equal to number, and to this number, so I'm expecting the user to enter the age. So maybe instead of sign in, I'm expecting him to sign up, let's say. And to this number, as you can see, if I right click and say open with live server, now this is a new input type, right, with HTML5. Now by default the validation is not there, so I'll just put a break statement so that it comes into the next line of code in the UI. Now here, if I'm trying to enter this value which is not numeric, so I will be able to enter new numbers, but I'm trying to hit any non-numeric character, it's not allowing except for E, because E can be considered from floating point, the exponential, right? But all other items I'm trying to hit, not allowing me to go back and do it. So if I try to increment, I can see there's a problem because age cannot be there in the minus sign, right? And that's the reason why you have been given other attributes from validation perspective, which are min and you have max. So with this input type equal to number, which is new with HTML5, right, you have been given. So Chrome does not allow you to enter the information, which is non-character values into it. Okay, now here, if I'm trying to enter some value which is in the range of it from the minimum and the maximum. So let's say the minimum I say as 80 and the maximum I say as 80. Now here, if I come back and use the slider, as you can see, I cannot go beyond 18, right? Even if I do it, fine, let's say I enter some value because that's going to have a higher precedence over it. If I click on submit, you say value must be greater than or equal to 18. Now I've used input type equal to submit. So actually the page should have been submitted, okay, but it will not until unless your form is validated. So unless all the elements, now here, if I don't enter anything, let's say, and if I just click on submit, you will see please fill out this field. Now you don't see the error message for age because you don't have required for there. Required is something which is an higher order thing, so you don't see all the error message immediately. But the moment I enter something, now if you're expecting, if I don't enter anything into age and click on submit button, and if you're expecting that yes this should also give an error, it actually does not. Reason? Because age is not required. Fine, it's not a mandatory field. So age can be blank, that's okay. If you want that, then you have to go back and mark age with required as well. Fine. Now if I'm trying to click on submit button, you can see please fill out the field for username, okay, from the order. And if I click on submit now, it says please fill out this field too. So I cannot have age being bypassed. Now if I say 8, fine, click submit. Now that's a range error. Now if I say 70, submit, now the form gets submitted and the pages right? So what we understood from this, that HTML5 provides you with some properties like required, it provides you with properties like min length, it provides you with properties like max length for a string to understand. Now here, when we talk about using this required, min length, min, max format, you understand, yes, these are some restrictive options that I can use for my user, and I can understand, yes, these are the different types of things which I can work on. But what if I want to have some validations to be done at my end? Let's say, suppose I want to have validation to be done for formatting purposes, right? So if I'm trying to have the user to enter some value, I would be wanting him to enter a value in a correct format. So we have checked for the presence of it. Fine. We have checked for whether the user has entered the correct value or not. We have restricted him to have the max length, the min length, and even the range values that we are expecting, okay, which is the min and the max. Fine. That's what we have specified too. But there also exists another property which takes in what we call as regular expressions. Now, regular expressions are nothing but a simple way of matching strings, of matching a pattern against a string. So let's say we have a string and we want a pattern to be matched against it. So regular expressions basically can allow you to just validate whether the string matches the format. And to have this regular expressions being done, you can actually use, there is a property called as pattern, and that can be used for doing. Now let's understand. So if you want to have a look at what regular expressions are, you have tons of, if I just go back and search for regular expressions, you can open up the MDN and you can understand regular expressions are patterns used to match character combinations in string. In JavaScript, regular expressions are also objects. And so these patterns are used with methods like exec, test, and other things. But pattern is an HTML5 attribute that accepts a regular expression. So how do we create a regular expression? Something like this. Fine. So you can see a forward slash. Fine. Something coming in. So you can see A, B plus C and then the forward slash. So there are different ways of doing it, right? So you have to actually learn, go back and learn how do you actually create this regular expression. So I'm not going to have any things on more onto it. If you want to go back and do it, you can simply go back and specify things and have a look at more onto the what regular expressions are. But these form the basis of expecting characters, n number of characters, okay, or some substring that you're expecting, or maybe digits, which is basically for D plus. So let's use such regular expressions against a pattern what we are expecting, right? So let's say, for example, if I want my user to, and now he has entered age, but maybe I also want him to enter his date of birth. Now, yes, I accept that this, if you are accepting age, then date of birth is also something which is kind of redundant, or if you are using date of birth, then age should not be there, but we are doing it just for the demonstration sake. Okay, so here I'm just going to accept the date of birth, which is DOB, and I'm expecting it to be in a form of, let's say, YYYY, right? So I want the user to enter the values in this form. Now here I'm going to have the input, okay, the type equal to text, and what I'm going to do here is I'm going to have some values to be entered in the pattern to be matched. So if I say pattern, right, and what I would want the regular expression pattern to be matching the date, which is MMDDYY format. Okay. Now if this data that I'm expecting it to be in an MMDDYY format, I need to understand that the content which I'm trying to put in is of a particular format. So for that, as I said, we would be making use of regular expressions. Now in this regular expressions, for all the values that you're going to enter when using the input types which are there, has to be following some regular expression. So I said \d, fine, is basically used for digits, and that's what we will be using to create a regular expression here. So I hope you understand that when I'm specifying something in a pattern, pattern is something that expects regular expression as an input, right? And this regular expression that we are going to write in is going to be of the format that we are expecting the user to enter his value inside it. So let's go back and accept the pattern for the user to enter. So here I'm expecting the month, date, and so maybe now if you want you can just jumble it around, because it's ddmmy by mmddy by anything that you're wanting, right? So it's now here it's not again very strict pattern that I'm writing. This is just for checking of the digits. So I'm going to go back and say \d, which is for the digit. So this \d stands for the date, another \d stands for another digit. Fine. Then again you can have an hyphen or maybe a forward slash. Now this is your textual value. Then is again digit, so I'll say \d for my months, and then I'll have a forward slash, and then now it's not necessary to have a forward slash, you can even have a hyphen. So the date, hyphen month hyphen year, that can also be there, but I'll choose to be forward slash because that's what we normally do with date. And then I will try to go back and just have 4 digits to be entered in, right? Okay, now this is a very simple regular expression pattern which I have used. I actually can write much more complex, because here I'm not checking whether it's a correct date, okay, ranging from 1 to 31, right? Or it's a correct month ranging from 1 to 12, fine. So that's what right now I'm not checking. I'm just checking for whether the entered value is in the correct format or not, right? So I'll just open it with live server, and with this pattern, now that you go in, just use break statement so that we have submit button coming downstairs. Now here I'll enter the value which is required. So age, maybe I'll be requiring it. Date of birth, now here I try to enter something which is not of the format that we are expecting. I'll just click on submit, and it says please match the requested format, right? Now here again, if I go back and say something like this, if I click on submit, just please match the request format, because we are expecting digit and you have provided the characters in it, right? So it's absolutely mandatory that you should be following the norms which are there. So let's say 01, 012, 198, right? So if I click on submit, then you will see the form got submitted and the page got refreshed, because what we entered were the correct value. Yes, as I said, this is not a very strong regular expression. I've just done it for simple demonstration purposes. And if I'm entering some values, let's say if I go back and have some other values being written, so let's say if I say 01 or even 55, 77, 9999999 for that matter, it's not going to complete. So sorry, 999, 999, it's not going to complain. And that's why you need to make sure that you have entered the correct format that's there. Now much stricter regular expression can exist for the date of birth to be mapped in, but I kept it simple so that just to tell you \d corresponds for a digit to be accepted, and we are expecting here the 8 digits to be entered in by the user. Now to talk more onto this, now you can have much complex regular expressions being done, right? Just to give an example, if I'm talking about, let's say kindly enter a mobile number, fine. So phone number or mobile number, let's say you're in Indian customer are wanting to enter the values of it. Now here, if I'm trying to do that, I can just go back and say input type equal to text, and I would be using pattern, and another regular expression can kick in, which can have, it starts with, that's what you say, something like this. So the caret symbol starts with, then 7, 8 or 9, that's how it should be starting up with. Okay. Then you can have \d, which is digits, right? And there can be 9 digits which are there, and they should be ending with a digit again, right? So this is how you can have pattern being specified. So there can be n number of complex patterns that you can use in. So here as specified that it should start with either 7, 8 or 9. Fine. Then there should be digits which should be 9 digits in total, and they should be ending it with digits. So that's another pattern that you can actually include to have your mobile number to be expected to be of the type that you are wanting the user to enter in. Right. Now you may want to have more deeper or much more complex things from mobile number. Let's say if you are accepting from a different country and things like that, you can select the country code and then have the regular expression to be mapped in. Okay, if this is the country code, then I need to map it against a different regular expression. So you can have n number of things being taken care of. Okay, if you are working up with this pattern, right? So we talked about validation. Now here, one more thing which you need to understand, as I've already told you, that input type equal to submit is what is going to fire all of this validation. So if I come back and I'm clicking on the submit button, I would be making sure that input type equal to submit is what is there, and there is a form tag. If I'm not using the form tag, then this validation would not be firing. Now one more thing which I want to specifically tell you about validation is this input type equal to submit, fine, that we have used is a submit button, but there also exists another type of a button. So we have seen we have different buttons. Okay, so if I talk about buttons, we said button is input type equal to button, fine. Then you had another button which can be created by using input type equal to submit. Now this submit is capable of submitting the form and sending the information back to the server. That's what we use it for. Then you also have input type equal to reset that we covered yesterday for resetting your form. So this is reset, and if you click on this, then your form will just be reset to the original value what it was. But along with these, you also have another tag that we call as button. Right now, what's the difference with this button tag? And that is there from these input types. Now obviously the first difference that you will see, these are all input types. Fine, the tag is different, and this button actually is same as input type equal to submit. Right now the reason you use or you have this button tag instead of using input type equal to, so obviously the question comes in, if this button is same as input type equal to submit, then why use this button tag? Now I'll be answering that once we understand how this button tag basically works in. So here I'm going to comment out my input type equal to submit, but here I'm going to go back and have a button tag, and in this button tag, instead of value being set as a property, I would just be using the submit as a text, the inner text of this button tag. Okay, the text is contained within the opening and the ending of this tag. So if I save and come back to my UI, if I click on the submit button, you would see it actually works in the same way what input type equal to button also works in. Okay. So from a validation perspective, it's important that we are in accordance to what the HTML is expecting our input types to be. Now the question is obviously why shouldn't I have just input type equal to submit and not use button type equal to or this button tag? Okay, what's the difference? There's not a difference. As I said, the similarity I've told you, by default this button is input type equal to submit, fine, but the difference is here I can go back and have some complex HTML to be present in. So this button can have a span, this button can have n number of other things contained inside it, right, to have much more complex HTML like an image or something being shown into this button, right? And that's what frameworks like Bootstrap and all try to make use of. So if at all you want to have something contained within your button, right, input type equal to submit or input type equal to button can only show you simple textual information. They cannot include graphics inside it. So if you want to include graphics, button is the tag for you to use. So that's how you will be making use of input type equal to submit. Right now, with HTML5 working in, now you have done all of these things from validation perspective, right? And you have done it by using HTML5. But what if by some means I want to go back and specify that, okay, whatever are the validations being done, I do want to have them cancel off, right? Meaning, yes, I understand. I'm first talking about what is validation. I then talk about how do you perform validations, different ways in which you can do it. You can do it by using JavaScript, you can do it by using some other JavaScript libraries, you can use it by using HTML5 built-in things. But then if I try to perform to say by some means, let's say I do not want to validate the form. So even if I've entered these values like required, min length, find min, max, then the pattern to be included, even if I've included all of this into my page or into my form, I still have a way of setting an attribute for this form not to be validated against. Meaning, if I'm saving this, if I'm viewing this into the UI, currently your form is validated. So I'll just be putting a break statement after this, that so your form is validated against the validations that you have done right now. But there exists a boolean valid attribute at a form level that's called as no validate. So if I hover the mouse over it, says this boolean attribute indicates that the form is not to be validated when submitted. If this attribute is not specified and therefore the form is validated, so this default setting can be overridden fine by form no valid attribute on a button or an input element as well. Okay. So if on this button itself, if you don't want to do that, okay, you can do set on this button as well. But here you can just go back and specify no validate. So if I come back into my UI and click on the button, you would see the validations did not handle and the page was kind of submitted. So each time you see this thing being refreshed, that's how your HTML page or form is not validated. Right now, as I'm saying, this may be performed dynamically as well, right? So we obviously wanting to have these things to be first present and then no validate, but this no validate attribute can also be added, used for the dynamic validations which can be performed. So here, when we talk about validations, now if at all I talk about using more on the validation set, now as we discussed on these, all things what are being performed are on the client side end, right? So at the client side, we have these ways by which we can check for the presence, we can check for the format, we can check for some conditions, let's say some pattern to be matching in, some conditions saying the max and the min width, that's length that is there, okay, for a particular string, or a range of the values by using min and max, right? I can do it by using the HTML5 attributes which are being given to me. Now, from a server-side validation perspective, as I said, it's also important to understand that, because when we go back to the server, we can choose to have a different validations before. Now, along with this, now let me use the same example. Yes, we're going to deal with this with more great detail later on as well. But before we move on, because we are into the validation, the last part which I want to tell you from validation perspective is, along with these input types, like we have input type equal to number, there is also another input type which is email address. And now instead of input type is equal to button, input type equal to text or input type equal to any of the things, I would just say input type equal to email. Right now, as I said, we are going to cover this in more detail, but right now, if I go back from a validation perspective, because we're in the validation, I'll just take off the no validate from here and I'll just put it in the comments. Now, how do you put a comment in HTML? This is how you put a comment in HTML. So it's a tag with form, and I'll say no validate as a property to be used in as an attribute. Now, with this input type equal to email, what can be done? Have a look. So here I give the values which are required. Fine, even I give the age. Now I give, let's say 01, 012, 1983, and let's say the mobile number, let's say 9, and then I have some email address. Now if I don't enter anything, if I click on the submit button, okay, 9, Yeah. So if I go back and say and I have the values being passed, age to be entered. So let's 01, 12, 123, the 10 characters. And here, if I click on the submit button, if I just say ABCD, right? Click on the submit button, it says, please include an @ in the email address. Okay? Now, the bad part about this email is, yes, it checks for an email address, but it only checks for the @ sign. It means if I just include an @ sign for it, and if I click on the submit button, it checks for the characters after it. If I click on submit, now the form got submitted, right? So it does not check for the dot sign. Fine, that's the thing that you need to understand with the input type equal to email. So input type equal to email expect us to have some format being followed from a validation perspective, and for that to cover in, okay, we need to understand that yes, these are different format, and the validation things that the email is going to stand, but it only checks for the @ sign, whereas it does not check for the dot sign. So you may not be wanting to directly use this email, but also maybe combine it with pattern to have a very strong kind of an email address to be typed in, okay, rather than you just going back and doing. Now, as I said, you can check on the client side for the format, but the correctness of it, whether it's a valid email or not, correct email or not, you can do it by going back to the server and sending email to the user for doing that. Right? Okay. So that's how you validate. Now with this, what we have covered, so we have seen how do you work with HTML5 forms, right? We went ahead and saw, okay, HTML5 forms are something which will be form tags which do not have any attributes or to be specified in, like the action or the type. Then we also went ahead and used the form without any validation. So we did it by using no validation as a part. Then we went ahead and used some JavaScript. I understand if that's something which is something which you don't know by default, okay, because you may not have worked with JavaScript, but that's a very simplest way to get started with JavaScript. It is like wrapping an event, and that's a practical example or use of why JavaScript is used for, and it is basically used for validation purposes. So on the click of a button, I went ahead and call a function. In that function, we had an access to the text box. Within the text box, I just checked if the value is present or not, and if the value is not present, I'm just displaying a message to the user, and then the user can go back and correct himself, right? So that's what we did with JavaScript. But then we said, I don't want to use JavaScript now, or I don't want to use any library for validating, because now HTML5 gives me a way of performing validations out of the box, right? So when we do that, you can go back and use a simple form tag which has required as an attribute. Fine. So required basically says that yes, you have some mandatory fields which cannot be bypassed, and I'm sure that you should be entering this details, and only then details are being entered in, then you have the correct information being sent back to the. Okay. Then we talked about min length, we talked about max length, which restricts the length of the string that the user is typing in. We also used to do it by using JavaScript. Now that is not required, and this is much more faster. So what advantage do you get with HTML5 things with over JavaScript? This is much more faster. Now internally, if I've just introduced to you something internally, yes, input type equal to uh, uh, input type equal to email, input type equal to, or using this man mix and things are internally trying to make use of some JavaScript coding as well, but it's much more faster than what you would write a JavaScript for execute. HTML5 validations are much more faster to be setting in. So we understood these properties. Then we saw input type equal to email as well. We saw pattern that expects regular expression. Regular expression is something which can validate a string against a particular pattern, and we need, as a developer, we need to create the pattern as an expression. So the regular expression is nothing but a pattern that we need to create in, okay, a format that we need to create in. So it's a different way that you write a regular expression, and that is what pattern is going to expect. And then we saw how to work with no validated. We saw different buttons which are there. Input type equal to button, input type equal to submit, input type equal to reset. Then you have the button tag being given in. We also saw the difference between it. Button is same as a submit. You can also use, see, is the fact that when you're using this button, it's not the fact that this button can only be used for input type equal to button. If I say input type equal to, if I go back and specify, let's say I'm going to have input type equal to reset or input type equal to button. Now, as I've told you, input type equal to button is not going to validate the form. So if I just save, come back to the UI and try to click on the submit button, nothing is going to work, right? Because you did not have submit button in there. So this button can also act as a different button altogether, right? Which is input type equal to button, reset, or button in input type equal to a button as well. Okay, submit, reset, or button. Any of these things can be working in, right? So this is what we learned today. So we talked about no validate as well, that if the form is having a no validate attribute, then the form will not be validated against. You can also put it on the button tag, get the form no validate as an boolean valid attribute, so that the validation of the form is being bypassed. So I hope you have enjoyed the session. Fine. So please do not forget to like and subscribe, right? And see you in the next session tomorrow at 5:30. So thank you all for being patient. Have a good evening. Bye.